Hello, welcome to the Daily Fantasy Flex Podcast, the NFL edition. I am your host, Bryan. I am joined, as always, by Matthew Freedman and Peter Jennings, a.k.a. CSU Ram 88. We're doing a three-man this week for the divisional round playoffs. Before we get into that, we're going to talk a little bit about last week's four-game slate. It was a weird one. We had some crazy upsets, so we'll get into those. But first, my co-host, as always, Pete. How are you doing, man? This is like your third or fourth podcast of the day, huh?
Yeah, just grinding it out today, doing a variety of things. It's been interesting. I am on a little less sleep than normal. I was trading in the alt markets till pretty late and had a arrangement, or I was meeting up with some buddies to play racquetball super early in the morning. So fading a bit, but excited to talk some NFL, and the playoffs are obviously great. So it'll be fun to recap last week and take a look at this week.
Yeah, Pete's staying up late to trade in the alt market, and Freeman is staying up late to apparently trade in the political market. I mean, what has our company turned into?
Yeah, betting on Oprah Winfrey. 24 hours ago, I wouldn't have thought that that's what I would be doing, but I was, researching, looking at all the different prop markets out there, and so Bales and I took the plunge there and wrote an article about it. So check that out on FantasyLabs.
I like your position, but just because I like it's not really a good indicator, Matt, considering my my absolutely horrific history speculating on politics.
Hey, everyone to this point in history who has bet on a billionaire TV star to win the presidency has won. So what could go wrong?
Yep, I'm loading it up right now.
Yeah, I mean, that's just a trend.
Yeah, exactly. It's a strong
not
betting
just a trend. It's a lock.
It's a lock. Yeah, I mean, 100%. I mean, how are you supposed to go against that? All right. Let's talk about last week, guys. A weird weekend started off by the Tennessee Titans coming back and upsetting the Kansas City Chiefs. And then later that night, we had the Falcons upset the Rams. The next day went a little bit more like we thought. The Jaguars and the Saints got the victories. Not a whole lot of points in that Jags-Bills game, but let's talk about the weekend. Obviously, it was a small slate, so there were very sort of tough decisions. Like if you got the quarterback right, then that definitely helped things. Like if you went Julio, Michael Thomas, if you went some of those guys as opposed to Gurley, that like really made you profitable versus not. Pete, how did your weekend end up going?
A lot better than the 2017 NFL season. Had a good week. Had a lot of exposure to Ted Ginn, which worked out. I was all in on Michael Thomas basically across the industry. And the Sunday-only slate worked out with Drew Brees. And, I played Fournette, who was kind of the bummer. But everyone played Fournette, especially on the Sunday-only. And I had a lot more Henry than the field. So overall, can't complain. Nothing crazy in tournaments, but grinded it out pretty nicely in cash. And hoping to do the same here in this next week. It's obviously fun, and I do think there's some pretty nice edges, especially with late swap. I was able to swap in a couple spots. Didn't end up winning every single one where I swapped, but at least opening the door is a nice little bit of equity that I think is an underrated aspect about playing these NFL playoff slates.
I have a question there for Pete on late swap regarding specifically the smaller slates. Do you think it's easier to do the late swap with the smaller slates just because maybe the player pool is easier to manage, or do you think it's basically the same no matter the size of the slate?
It's a lot different because the games are more spread out. So it's hard with the way, especially with no Sunday night game. There used to be a nice edge with a Sunday night game, but now it's very hard to swap with just the 4 p.m. games in the main slate. So there's still advantages on like the 2-game slate, Sunday night to Monday night. But there's, people have so many different combos. This is amazing because you kind of know where you stand, especially as you get farther into the weekend. Going to that Carolina game, I knew exactly where I wanted to be. And, certain spots, this guy would have Thomas, or you knew a guy would have Olsen or whoever, and you could pivot to different plays. And, it was interesting and certainly a fun week.
Yeah, so obviously there's value in doing that. Like if you're blocked in like your head-to-head, pivoting is always our
tournament is the bigger one though.
Yeah, so but like how are you doing that in like if someone's playing like a smaller buy-in which has like just so many people, like how do you deal with that? Like obviously if you're higher stakes and the pool is a little bit smaller as far as entrants go, like you can more managed, like who has what. But what if you're in like just a huge field? Like, how do you deal with late swap then?
Well, you kind of have to gauge how you're doing versus the field. You look at ownership and you figure out, okay, I really need to go contrarian. Or if you had a really nice start, let's say you started off with like Henry and I don't even know who did well in that game, Kansas City defense, and then you faded Todd Gurley. Now all of a sudden you can probably go a little more chalk than what you would have done initially. And if you had Gurley or you had let's say you had like a Gurley Fournette team going into that Saints game, you'd want to do something real crazy to try to get away from the other ownership. So you have to just kind of gauge how you're doing versus the field, and then make more chalky decisions or contrarian decisions based on kind of where you stand. And also, obviously, it matters who you think are the best plays too. So in tournaments, there's definitely some great ways to pivot. Not having Gurley, you'd feel better about Kamara, even though he didn't have a good game. I just think there's a lot of different optionality in terms of what you can do. And certainly it's with the way the games are structured, you kind of know who's going to be chalk and who's going to be contrarian.
Yeah, that's a good point. Let's talk just briefly on these games, maybe some surprises or things that we took away from the weekend. So, Freedman, let's talk about the upsets, the Titans over the Chiefs and the Falcons over the Rams. Like before the playoffs, we have like look-ahead lines where like this team would be favored over this team in the Super Bowl. And those are interesting because like you sort of have to speculate if the Titans do get to the second or third round, like obviously they would show something in those couple of rounds that would maybe change our minds on what a line should be. Same with the Falcons. It seems that the Titans and Falcons played a little bit differently than they had all year. What are your thoughts on those teams?
Well, with the Titans specifically, one of the big things is that there was no DeMarco Murray there, just like destroying offensive drives with his inefficiency, and a fantastic day for DeMarco Murray truthers, not DeMarco Murray truthers, Derrick Henry truthers, finally getting to see him as the full-on workhorse. I don't know if it's something that can be translated into future games. I just can't see. We can obviously talk about this more coming up, but who knows what's going to happen in New England. But an interesting game, just to kind of think about reflecting on the season, what it would have been like if Derrick Henry had been the workhorse for the entire season. They could have a totally different team, like different seeding. That was an interesting spot for them. And then the Falcons, I wouldn't say their offense came alive. It was just kind of more of what they've been doing, but their defense has actually been surprisingly good for the last 6 weeks or so. And I think that will be the thing really to watch with them to see if their defense can keep up what it's been doing. And then, with the other games, it's fascinating. All of the underdogs covered. So I think one of the first times in wild card history we've seen that happen. So that was kind of nice to see. Especially with the Falcons, I think their defense more than their offense is going to be the key moving forward.
Yeah. And interestingly enough.
Go ahead, Brad. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, interestingly enough, the Falcons, who were an underdog last week, are now a favorite this week. It's interesting how that goes. Pete, go ahead with what you're talking about, and just curious your thoughts on these teams that are playing this week. The Falcons, Titans, obviously we think of maybe a little bit differently about them, and even like the Jags really struggling to score against the Bills was not encouraging moving on in the playoffs.
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment that that shows how unpredictable football can be at times. I think the sentiment around, most of the markets was really heavy on the favorites. We saw lines move towards the favorites in certain situations, and obviously there's big spreads for the wild card round. But that just shows that there's more parity in football than people realize a lot of times. And it was interesting to see the underdogs all cover. This week is challenging. I do think that you have to look at some teams just a little bit differently potentially. Obviously, the Titans ran the ball effectively, which was nice to see. Hard to imagine they're going to be able to do that if the Patriots can put a lot of points on them. I think the concern for them is they've been so bad in the secondary, and if Tom Brady has a big game, they're not going to be able to play the way they want to play. So that is an interesting spot. There's obviously a gargantuan spread there. The Jaguars and Pittsburgh game is probably the most intriguing to me from both a betting standpoint and a DFS standpoint. Obviously, the Jaguars crushed the Steelers at home, Steelers historically have been a lot better at home, especially Big Ben. You have the Antonio Brown, kind of how effective is he going to be? But the spread's still 7.5. So we want to jam in these Steelers at home, but they're facing this historic defense. So that's the most intriguing game to me. And then, I think the NFC games are going to be interesting and nice. I think Nick Foles will probably play a little bit better than people are expecting. And it is curious to see the Falcons be favored. I think that's the first time the road team's been favored in the divisional round that I think ever. I think Schefter tweeted that out.
Yeah, if it's not the first time ever, it's the first time definitely that the number 1 seed has been the underdog. So definitely fascinating to watch that.
Yeah, number 1 seed.
So that Jaguars Steelers game, Freeman, we've been talking about. We've both written a lot of articles. I write the funnel piece every week, and then maybe a month or so ago, you wrote a piece about coaches sucking at coaching football.
Yeah.
And this is the game that we pointed to all year, was that the Jaguars have a historically elite secondary, and the Pittsburgh Steelers, in the last game they played, Ben Roethlisberger threw 55 times, and they just did not give the ball to Le'Veon Bell. So I think that's sort of a underrated thing in football. I was listening to Evan Silva and Sharp do their podcast, and they were talking about the assumption of coaching competency, or I can't remember exactly the phrase, but it was just assuming that coaches are good at coaching football. And I think we've seen from last week and earlier this year that a lot of these coaches, that is not exactly a correct assumption,
No, we can't assume anything with any of these coaches. Maybe a few, but for most of them, we can't really assume that they should be doing what the numbers would suggest they should be doing to play in an efficient way. So yeah, as Pete said, this is a really intriguing game. I've recently started trying to create lines to handicap this. One, just to get the practice of doing that, but then also to enhance my own sort of sports betting on this. I don't know. I'm on the Jags, which I don't ever want to be on the side that has Blake Bortles on it, but I'm on the Jags, which I'm surprised by. But yeah,
I made that pick on the Three Donkeys podcast. 7.5 points is just a lot, but yeah, Blake Bortles was throwing. There was some wind, but some of those passes were the worst passes I've ever seen in a play.
They were so bad.
And every team, it's not hard against the Jaguars. You just load the box, you stop Fournette. This Pittsburgh defense is good. So it's really scary backing the Jags. That's the argument that you'd make if you're taking Pittsburgh. But, this defense dominated this offense. And obviously everyone's saying, well, they're going to hand the ball to Le'Veon Bell now, and you can attack the Jaguars on the ground, and they're going to make a big adjustment. They're at home. That aspect and that narrative scares me. But I still think this defense is so good. It's hard to feel comfortable laying 7.5 points.
Yeah. And I'll always go back to are we positive that they're actually going to give the ball to Le'Veon Bell and just go run heavy? That is very up in the air.
And the Jaguars may make some adjustments to really shut down the run too. You don't know. We'll see. Obviously the Steelers have a ton of weapons. They're a really good team, but I hope the Jaguars can show up and maybe Blake Bortles can get his head out of his ass.
If you had to rank the quarterbacks in that game, Tyrod Taylor, Blake Bortles, and then and another amazing performance from Nathan Peterman. I will say that he's just
Bortles is the worst quarterback. He was the worst quarterback.
He's worse than Peterman? Oh my gosh. Peterman
he did run well. Maybe they'll just go to a read option and just try to run the ball a bunch with Bortles and Leonard Fournette. And they do have some playmakers with their receivers, so I don't know. It is scary to think about investing in Blake Bortles, though.
Peterman had 4 snaps last week. He threw an interception and fumbled on 2 of his 4 snaps.
Maybe it's better than Bortles.
That's impressive. I don't that's just one of the most productive things I've ever heard.
This is a random side note, but I was doing some research on what the Browns might do with the number 1 overall pick, based on the history of what Glenn Dorsey, their new general manager, has done previously. And so he was a scout with the Packers way back in the day when they traded a first rounder to the Falcons for Brett Favre in '92. Favre played 5 snaps as a rookie. he threw interceptions on 2 of those snaps. One of them was a pick six. On 2 others, he threw an incomplete pass, and then on the 5th snap, he was sacked for an 11-yard loss. Like, the worst 5 snaps like of a rookie in history, like, amazingly. And they traded a first-rounder for him, and he turned into like the greatest quarterback of all time. So Nathan Peterman, you never know. He could turn into the next Favre.
That's amazing. That's an amazing story. Oh man. All right, let's get into the player pool here. We'll definitely tie in some of our game analysis when applicable here. But let's start with the quarterback position, and let's talk our way through these positions. We'll talk chalk, we'll talk pivots, and then as necessary, we'll still bring in our regular segments here. We'll talk about who we might want to stack with our quarterbacks and stuff like that. But Freedman, let's start with the quarterback position. Tom Brady is the most expensive guy. You had written a Vegas projection article from, I believe, yesterday. And just based on New England, their passing proficiency and this line, they are projected or implied for 30.3 points. It seems that Brady is just going to be the uber chalk. Am I wrong there?
Yeah, it's a really tough situation because, he's 7,000, not super expensive, but he's more expensive than all the other quarterbacks on the slate. But he has the highest ratings in our models for good reason. He has a great matchup. As you mentioned, the Patriots are implied for a lot of points. A lot of those should come via the passing game. So it makes sense in a vacuum why he should be in lineups. But just in terms of roster construction, I think it might be kind of hard to fit him in there if you want to get a lot of those other players in there, and especially because the quarterback position, relatively it's flat in comparison to what you might get out of some of the receivers or some of the running backs. Brady, he makes sense as a player, but I think people will probably want to pivot to someone else, but then it's just hard to know who that is. And I'd like to get Pete's thought on this, but you just look like Roethlisberger at home. That's the decent spot for him, but he's going against the Jags. Drew Brees on the road playing against the Vikings, who might be on defense just as good as the Jags, pretty close to it. And then who else are you going to go with after that? Nick Foles.
You think people will go back to Mariota?
I'm looking at Nick Foles right now, which is just absolutely disgusting. I think Mariota's a little bit interesting because the game flow should set up for him. But, yeah, give me the home quarterback who I think is really underrated right now. He's put up some really good fantasy seasons. I think Bales mentioned it today. He had, one of the 5th most productive season at the quarterback position. Obviously, that was a Chip Kelly first-year offense. But Nick Foles, at home facing this Atlanta defense, which I know has been playing better, I'm fine with it. I like Brady a lot, but I'd rather use that money at wide receiver and get some of his targets. I think you can soak up a lot of the Patriots offense with the position players and just hope that the difference between Foles and, these expensive quarterbacks, so mainly Brady, isn't that drastic where you're in big trouble. So, yeah, Brees and Roethlisberger have tough matchups. Case Keenum's fine, but he's in that same price tag, and New Orleans defense has played better. So it's a tough week. In years past, we've had some pretty obvious spots, and the really only obvious spot here is the Patriots offense. Right. I think I'd rather soak up those guys with the receivers and running backs than with Brady.
Yeah, and if you think it's tough on DraftKings, look at FanDuel quarterback. Brady is even more expensive relatively on FanDuel. He's at 8.8, so he's 700 more than any other player. And then sort of the discount to even the lowest price guys like Nick Foles and Blake Bortles is they're still really expensive at over 7K. So if you're having trouble on DraftKings, FanDuel is going to be just as hard to figure out what you want to do at quarterback. Just sort of thinking about equity of their projection versus ownership, who are the guys that are standing out in GPPs for you, Matt?
I don't think anyone's going to want Blake Bortles. I don't think so. But he's so volatile that would it be surprising if he had a game where he throws for 300 yards and 3 touchdowns?
That would be very surprising to me.
I mean, it would be surprising, but like he does that sometimes.
Yeah.
He has these Blake Bortles type of like blow up games where out of nowhere he has huge production, and it's like, well, we didn't see that coming, but like it happens every fifth game or something like that. So like it does happen with him. So
I'm with you on the Blake Bortles contrarian call. I just think the upside is with his legs. That's where I could see something. I mean, dude was freaking running like a total stud in that last game. They're like, all right, you can't get it done with passing the ball. All right, you're going to run the ball now. And he ran for he had 10 attempts for 88 yards. Like, I could see him rushing a touchdown, and that's where he wins you a GPP is, you know, he has like 50 yards rushing and a rushing touchdown, and quarterbacks don't really go off, and you get, all the other stats.
Yeah, he's their leading rusher.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. I think he does have value there. The thing is, I'm thinking with GPPs, like, you want to stack him with someone. Like, if Bortles has a ton of production on the ground, I don't know how good that is for you if you actually stacked him with a number of his receivers. You know what I mean? I think you'll end up underperforming at that position. But
yeah, you could run him out there naked by himself, but I don't mind the stack either. I think it's fine.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think Bortles is going to have no ownership. And I think Foles will have fairly limited ownership as well.
I think Foles will be a little bit more heavily owned. I think, Brian, you're on mute. I mean, I don't think it'll be super heavily owned. I think quarterback will be spread around. I think it's a really tough position, but I think Foles by the end of the week, people might be on him as like a home quarterback. You look at the totals. I mean, obviously everyone wants to get the Patriots players in, but I don't know. Generally, in situations like this, you want to spend down on quarterback, but it's pretty gross.
What are your thoughts on Matt Ryan? I mean, he completed 70% of his passes last week. Obviously, the volume wasn't there, but the week before it was. He threw 45 times in a must-win game against the Panthers, had over 300 yards. He hasn't had like a multi-touchdown day in quite a while, so that's obviously why he is so cheap at 5.7. But I mean, as a favorite and 5.7, like, is there any interest in him in GPPs?
Matt, what do you think, man?
I'm not super interested. I just don't think it's the Matt Ryan year. Like, I had
a personal matter today too, which is kind of bizarre.
Yeah. I mean, I think whatever that was, it'll shake out by the time the game comes around. But it hasn't been the year for that offense in general and for him in particular. They're just running a little bit more near the goal line. And so he's not getting some of those cheaper touchdowns, and they're not passing quite as much. They're playing a little bit slower. It's just, I don't think it's his year, and it's a good defense that he's going against.
It's a really good defense he's going against. I'm curious to see what this issue is. He took a nasty hit too in that last game. Did you guys see him get cut up there on his upper neck / side of his face? It's just a tough spot overall for him. So I think he's fine. He's cheap, but to me, it's just a gross position. Like, I could see Keenum doing well if you're looking at team totals only. Just so the problem is the Saints defense has played really well. But the nice thing about that game is it's last and it's indoors. So for tournaments, I like having a lot of exposure to this Minnesota Saints game.
Let's go to running back position. So we have Le'Veon Bell at the top. He is 9,600 on DraftKings. He is 94 on FanDuel. He is much, much more expensive than everyone on DraftKings. Kamara is close to him on FanDuel, but Kamara is a little bit cheaper on 7.8. He's the second highest priced guy there. Pete, I'm curious your thoughts on, like, compare this slate to last week's, because it was relatively flat at quarterback. We had Todd Gurley as, like, by far the most expensive guy. You sort of had to figure out whether you wanted to go him in cash games or not. And then you had a really, really expensive tight end versus the field. And in Kelsey, we have that with Gronk this week. And then you have some interesting stud wide receivers. So it seems like roster construction-wise, like you sort of are dealing with the same issues this week as you did last week.
Yeah, you are. I mean, I liked last week a little bit better because I thought there were some clear, really good spots. This week it's hard to, like, really fall in love with an offense outside of the Patriots, who are all really expensive or kind of tough to peg as well. I think Le'Veon Bell is going to end up being uber chalk around the industry. I think people are just going to buy him at home, and I'll probably be one of those guys. I think it's a really good spot to invest in him.
So why did you fade Gurley in cash last week, but you're more interested in Le'Veon this week?
I played Gurley. I played Gurley on DraftKings. I did not play him as much on FanDuel. On FanDuel, I played Fournette and Henry, and it's just because Henry allowed me to get Michael Thomas and Kelsey. And I thought Kelsey was a really, really good play on FanDuel last week. Ted Ginn was really the key last week, and that was just, obviously pretty lucky. The guy that's interesting in terms of ownership when you start looking at, FanDuel and even I guess on DraftKings is some of these mid-tier receivers. Like someone like Brandon Cooks, I think is going to end up getting talked about quite a bit. He's a good way to get Patriots exposure. Obviously has a lot of upside. You have the Minnesota receivers. You have, secondary options on the Steelers like Juju Smith-Schuster, Martavis Bryant. That mid-tier range is kind of interesting to me. I wonder how much people are going to go there. The challenge is going to be figuring out what to do with the other running back slot. I like the Patriots guys. I think Deion Lewis is going to be interesting. We'll have to monitor what's going on with the injuries for all the Pats players. But yeah, it's a crazy situation because you're probably going to want to spend up for Le'Veon Bell, and then it's kind of where do you go from there? And I think Deion Lewis wanted to be in pretty chalk, but his price has gone up. What do you guys think about him and kind of where roster construction will be?
Yeah, I'm there with Pete on Deion Lewis as someone who's really intriguing, especially if we get word that James White and Rex Burkhead or Gillislee or some of those guys aren't available, in part because they're such home favorites, but then also he's a competent receiver. And so if White is out and you can project a decent amount of receiving work for Deion Lewis, I think that is really significant. One guy who's interesting, in part because he's so cheap, is Ingram, but not a great spot for him against Minnesota. But, I think he still is likely to get double-digit touches. And based on the Vegas lines and then on the market share that we normally see for the rushing load and how that breaks down for New Orleans, they're still likely to get some points on the ground. And Ingram still leads that team in rushing touchdowns by a pretty significant margin. So if I had to go with one of those guys, he would definitely be the one I'd have an interest in.
Yeah, I think Deion Lewis is just going to be like super, super chalk. He's gone for over 30 DK points in each of his last two games, and he's like almost a 2-touchdown favorite against the Titans, who I think people are not really going to respect them even after the victory last week. So, yeah, I think Lewis and Le'Veon are going to be like the clear chalk, and you're going to have to try to get away from them or have different roster construction in other positions to be unique. Pete, I'm curious your thoughts on Derrick Henry. He's really expensive on DraftKings. He's more affordable on FanDuel. He's 6'7" there. He has a 99% bargain rating on FanDuel. He leads the position with in projected plus minus. Obviously, the issue is like big dog. He was a dog last week, and they really like built their offense around him. What are your thoughts on him? Like, obviously, he's probably a little risky for cash with that spread, but are you going to have some exposure to him, especially on FanDuel?
Yeah, I think you want some exposure to him. The game flow is really bad potentially, but yeah, that's what they want to do. If they want to stay competitive in this game, they're going to have to run the football, play good defense, and Derrick Henry was effective, and it's not like this Patriots defense is as good as prior ones, and I do think that especially if Mariota can get going a little bit early, he's going to have a lot of touchdown upside. So especially on FanDuel, I think with that cheap price tag and his touchdown equity, even as a big dog, makes him an intriguing play. I still prefer getting up to, like a Deion Lewis, Le'Veon Bell, but in tournaments, I think it makes a lot of sense.
I'm curious about your thoughts on Jay Ajayi. He's standing out a little bit in our models, very cheap, especially on DraftKings. They're at 4,600. I don't know if there's any correlation here, but within the last 4 games, so in the games in which we have seen Nick Foles, he's been targeted 2 to 4 times. So starting to get a little more work as a receiver. And then obviously we've also seen his rushing load increase. And it's possible that with Foles at quarterback, the Eagles will want to have more of a run-heavy attack. I don't know. It's a situation where I think you can project double-digit touches and 70 to 80 yards total. Some touchdown equity there. They're playing at home. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I like it. I think that makes sense. I mean, the nice thing here is, again, playing at home is big at this position. So I like it. I just wonder about ownership. So let's go through in terms of how we think ownership is going to be soaked up. Do you guys agree that Le'Veon Bell is going to be the most heavily owned?
Yeah, him and Lewis.
Who do you think is number 3?
That's tough, but I mean, I think I don't know, maybe Kamara. I don't know.
No, I don't think people will be able to the money for Kamara. That's the thing. I think these Minnesota running backs, they could definitely be there, and I think Derrick Henry, people will chase points, especially on FanDuel. The interesting ones to be contrarian is going to Devontae Freeman, or a really interesting one after he played so bad last.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But, I mean, if you're the Steelers, you're just selling out against the run to try to stop stop Fournette and make Blake Bortles beat you. So running back is definitely the most interesting position because there's just a lot of really good options. Quarterback, you're kind of puking in your mouth thinking about it. Running back, there's a lot of great options.
Yeah, it's tough. Of the starting running backs, do you think Fournette, just after last week, is going to be the lowest owned?
I think he'll be one of them. Yeah.
Yeah.
I do think he'll be one of the lowest owned. And, I think, in terms of we'll see. It'll be interesting to see where Levitan and the team, we all got, Ian, you guys, where projected ownership ends up on some of these guys. But I do think there's some big advantages in GPPs here for sure, especially at the running back position. That's a great spot to be contrarian.
Yeah. All right, let's move to the wide receiver position. We have Antonio Brown at the top at 8-1 on DraftKings facing the Jags. And then we have a bunch of guys like Pete had mentioned in this 6-7K range, going down. We have Julio, Thielen, Michael Thomas, Brandon Cooks, Steph Diggs, and Juju Smith-Schuster. So that mid-tier is very robust compared to last week. Freedman, I'll start with you. What are your thoughts on the top guys like Antonio Brown, Julio, some of these Minnesota guys, and they're obviously have pretty tough matchups. So that may be hard to really go pay up for wide receivers in cash games. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, Antonio Brown, it's a tough matchup anyway, and then he is coming off of that calf injury, and I know the reports are that he's going to be supposedly around 100%, but I think in cash, it's a little hard to trust a guy with that matchup coming off an injury, having not played for a month. So I don't know. That kind of gives me hesitation there. And then Michael Thomas, I know he's, a Pro Bowl caliber receiver, and, he's put together a string of pretty good performances. But he does have a tougher matchup on the road going against Xavier Rhodes and the rest of that Minnesota defense there. So I think tough matchups for those two guys. And then on the other side, Thielen is a good player. Stephon Diggs is good, but both of those guys have tough matchups going against the Saints secondary. So I don't know. Those, they're all good options just in terms of an average game for them. You would expect them to be targeted. The ball is going to have to go somewhere, but I think they will be less efficient than we normally see. And so that makes me a little more interested in someone like Julio Jones, although he is expensive, and still interested in Brandon Cooks. I think he's the big one for me. A good matchup, and then just a super high implied total there for him.
Great matchup. We saw Tyreek Hill get behind the defense. Yeah. Titans are going to have a lot of problems trying to stop this Patriots offense. So I think Cooks will get single coverage in a lot of spots, and I really, really like him. I think he's going to end up being somewhat chalky, but he's a great way to get exposure to this Pats offense.
Yeah, so Pete, what are you doing with some of the other guys? It seems like if you just want to create a unique lineup, if you took 3 of these top guys as opposed to Le'Veon or Gronk, that's the way to have a contrarian lineup. I guess the question is, is there enough equity to be able to do something like that for GPPs?
It's going to be tough to fit all those guys. You have to start, going through some of these really bargain bin type players. So, yeah, I mean,
naked Bortles.
Yeah, naked Bortles. I think I like Foles, man. I that's my first read is just Foles ends up playing well. I saw a nice quote from him. I just think Foles is a little sneakier than people are giving him credit for. I also, this Philly team, obviously losing Wentz is huge, but they're capable of playing really good defense here at home and some extra time off. And I like the receivers more than most. Alshon Jeffrey's a really nice, big red zone target, possession receiver. I think that Nelson Aguilar really found his spot there in the slot. And, Ertz is, obviously we have Gronk on this slate, but Ertz is so talented. So he has good weapons, and I like the fact that he's at home. So, to go back to your question, it's going to be tough. In terms of, wide receiver value, that's somewhere I've been struggling a little bit to find people I feel really comfortable with. I guess the plays would be going back to these Tennessee receivers and just hope that they're in garbage time and just those guys are racking up targets. Eric Decker obviously got there late, which was nice last week. Could see Corey Davis, who was wide open for a touchdown, being a pretty nice play as a young guy. So that's the challenge. Even with Rashard Matthews, I don't mind. Running back, obviously there's a couple options, but I definitely want to spend up there. So, yeah, it's a tricky but interesting roster construction week, I think.
Yeah, Freeman, what are your thoughts on the Philly guys and then some of the cheaper New England guys, whether it's Chris Hogan, who's probable to play? How do you be contrarian with that game?
The Eagles receivers are interesting, especially Alshon Jeffrey. And then for the Patriots receivers, Hogan, I mean, I think if he's back and he's healthy, he's definitely interesting. Although, again, I'm always a little hesitant about receivers in that first game back from an injury. And so Hogan hasn't played in quite a while. So I would be a little hesitant with him. And part of it has to do with whether you are willing to go with Gronk, because, I mean, I think he's the clear number one receiver in that offense. It's just a question of, do you want to pay up for tight end? And so if you are, then I think you can't go with Hogan or can't go with Amendola.
So who do you guys think are going to be the chalky stacks? We have Brady, Gronk, Cooks, and then we have do you think is Foles actually going to be a decently chalky stack with Alshon and those guys and Ertz?
I don't know.
He might be.
I mean, Pete, it seems like you're thinking that Foles is going to be fairly chalky.
I mean, no.
As a pivot.
I'm attracted to Nick Foles. Especially on DraftKings, you get that savings. This will come back to bite me, I'm sure. I mean, the Eagles are not even implied for 20 points, but it's a defensive week when you look at it outside of the Patriots. So
right.
I want to get these patch receivers. I want to get Deion Lewis, and then I can save and make the roster work with someone like Nick Foles. And maybe roster construction will change a little bit, but that's where I'm leaning right now.
I mean, I think there are going to be some people who are still attracted to Roethlisberger at home despite the tough matchup, and they'll look to some of the other receivers there outside of Antonio Brown. Maybe still stack with Antonio Brown, but there's still Martavis there. There's still Juju there that they could stack with. So I could see some people doing that and thinking, despite the matchup, you still have the Steelers favored pretty significantly at home, and it's a good passing offense. So some people might do that, but I think it's hard to look at this week and know which stacks are going to be popular because, as Pete mentioned, it is a defensive week. And so outside of Brady, I think ownership is going to be fairly flat with those quarterbacks and as a result with the stacks that are based around the quarterbacks.
Yeah. And sometimes I think quarterbacks ownership is a little bit inflated, when there's a really popular wide receiver because you want to stack them. So I do think that Foles actually might get some traction as the week's going on because I'm just thinking we can move tight end. As far as matchup and price goes and opportunity, and we sort of just measure all of that in price, are Gronk and Ertz just the two best pass catchers on the slate? When you put all of that into price and their matchups and opportunity and stuff like that. Ertz is 5'8", but like if you're looking, like, are there, like, he's cheaper than all of these other guys we talked about. Like, he's cheaper than Juju, so then you have to go down to, like, Richard and some of those guys. Like, he seems to be, like, a really, really good play at 5'8". Like, if you want to go Gronk, it seems like it might be a weak peak to, like, due to tight ends with Ertz and Gronk.
Yeah, it's hard to fit both of those guys, but yeah, I like both Ertz and Gronk, and you just start comparing them to their wide receiver counterparts. It makes a lot of sense this week. So I'm into getting exposure to one of those guys. If I want to save a tight end this week, it starts to get a little tricky. I mean, you can go to Austin Hooper, hope he falls in the end zone. I'm going to monitor that situation with the Steelers because those guys could be pretty nice as well. Vance McDonald got a couple targets and looked pretty good versus Houston before the Cleveland game. He could be a punt play, Jesse James. But, yeah, I like the idea of spending up on these tight ends who I think have a really high touchdown, have a lot of touchdown equity. And, yeah, I mean, the expensive receivers are really tough this week outside of Cooks, who I really, really like.
Yeah, one of the things that's really nice about Ertz is that although it's a smaller sample, he has exhibited some chemistry with Nick Foles. If you discount Week 17 in which Foles played only, I think, 3 series, you can see Ertz having, I think it was 9 targets in Foles' first start and then 14 targets in the second start. Like, that is just massive usage for a tight end. I mean, for really any receiver, but especially for a tight end. So he's functioning basically as the number one receiver in that offense, getting good matchups there in the slot, which is primarily where he's playing. I mean, sometimes they'll split him out wide, but he's playing basically as a big slot receiver and not a inline tight end. So a lot of good things there for him. Yeah, I mean, I think you could maybe see Foles get inflated ownership if people want to stack with Ertz, but maybe they'll go with Ertz and then stack a quarterback with another receiver there too.
Yeah, I mean, if you just look at, like, the percentage of passes to a position, I mean, Tom Brady obviously likes to target Gronk. He throws to him on about 25% of his passes, and Nick Foles has been right there when he started. He's thrown to Ertz on over 25% of his passes, 25.7%. So, yeah, it is clear that he trusts Ertz, and, I mean, at 5'8", it's – I don't know, like, he's – like, price-wise, he just seems like just a really, really safe play, like, when you compare him to these wide receiver counterparts. Any other tight ends we want to talk about? I mean, it's not a great week. I mean, like, Kyle Rudolph is a guy who is a big body in the end zone. Delaney Walker. Didn't have a bad week last week. Freedman, any thoughts on those guys?
Yeah, I mean, Rudolph is interesting in that he does get targeted pretty significantly in the red zone. And with tight ends, I think, accepting guys like Gronk and Ertz who do get significant targets and so they can accumulate yards. Basically, with tight ends, you're looking for touchdowns. And Rudolph is a guy who, over the last 2 years, has led the Vikings in touchdowns receiving. So he has good touchdown equity. I mean, I don't know how you feel about going with receivers who are tied to Case Keenum in the playoffs. Like, I mean, he's been good. He's been serviceable this year. But, I don't know. I think the more I'm looking at it, Ertz, given the discount that he is to Gronkowski, but the usage that he has, I think he's bordering on, I don't know. I mean, it's tough to say, like, must play, but, like, he's catching my attention more as I'm looking at this.
Yeah, Pete, what are your thoughts on the Vikings, Rudolph, and then just, like, the passing offense in general? Like, are you scared about Case Keenum? It seems the betting market is at least a believer in him. They have the second best odds to win the Super Bowl right behind the Patriots. And then even, like, some of these look-ahead lines, because the Super Bowl is actually in Minnesota this year, so it would be a home game for the Vikings would actually be favored over the Patriots based on these look-ahead lines. Obviously, that could change based on the market. But what are your thoughts in general about the Minnesota offense and, like, moving forward in the playoffs?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Keenum can play well in this spot. I think on the ground they can do well. Hitting, especially these running backs like McKinnon, I think will have a decent opportunity in the passing game as well. Rudolph makes sense. Lattimore, it'll be interesting to see where he lines up the most. Obviously, their pass defense has been really good. They've been able to get an effective pass rush this year as well. So I think the Vikings' plan will be to kind of attack the middle of the field and leverage, the athleticism of McKinnon with some screens and kind of mitigate that pass rush. So I do think he can be effective. He's been really efficient all year. He's at home, and obviously right now they're a nice favorite with a healthy team total. So I think he's fine. It just, you're clicking Case Keenum when Breeze and Roethlisberger are the same price. Obviously the matchup's a little bit better, but it's still the Saints who have been playing pretty well. So it's a tricky one to decipher, and something that hopefully we'll get more data. I think the props will be really interesting for this week. They've obviously they're relatively efficient in the playoffs. So I'll be curious to see kind of where that shakes out and how the line movement is at the end of the week. And then the one other thing too is the nice benefit for Keenum is being indoors. So we'll see if weather plays a factor. I haven't looked too much into the weather at this point. Obviously we're recording here on Tuesday night, but that could be another factor that makes those guys a little bit more enticing.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, let's move to defenses before we get out of here. So as far as the pricing structure goes, the highest priced defense on DraftKings this week is the Steelers at 3.8 going against the Jaguars, who could only not muster many points against the Bills last week. We have Atlanta at 3.5, and then the Jags at 3.3. Those are the top three defenses. It's an interesting week for sure for defenses. We've talked about it all pod, that it does seem to be a defensive week where those units are definitely going to impose their will on some of these offenses. Freeman, I'm curious your thoughts on defenses. Is there like a clear consensus, or do you think it's smarter to maybe spread some exposure out and hope for some volatility with like a touchdown or two?
Really interested in New England's defense. It's possible that getting out to a lead, they could make the Titans' offense fairly one-dimensional. They're not that expensive. And then also, we have the research that shows that the larger point spreads are correlated with defensive scoring. And so, they're going against a team that's implied for, I believe, the fewest points on the slate, but then they also have the largest spread. So there are multiple ways in which they could end up having a pretty good defensive outing. So I think for me, it's the Patriots. If you look at any of the defenses that are cheaper, I don't really like their matchups so much. So I think that's probably where I will be going.
Yeah, so, they're really interesting, Pete. I'm curious your thoughts specifically about the Patriots. As a unit, they're probably the worst defense in the slate, just like as a defense, but also they're facing Mariota, who leads all quarterbacks in the slate in interception rate, in sack rate, and, as Freeman just mentioned, they're 2 touchdown favorites, which means that they'll be able to have some good game script there as a defense, being able to play back a little bit. So what are your thoughts on them?
Yeah, I like them. I want to get the I want to get the Steelers where I can to attack the Jaguars. Obviously, you have to pay a premium for them, but watching Blake Bortles play, this guy is going to throw some interceptions. And considering I've already invested my pride and $100 on the 3 donkeys with the Jaguars, I need some hedging in my life by investing in the Pittsburgh Steelers defense. I also like the fact that you compare it with Le'Veon Bell. Makes a lot of sense. Obviously, that's a challenge when they're the most expensive defense on the board on DraftKings, but I still think that makes a lot of sense. Patriots are intriguing to me. I actually like the Eagles on DraftKings a lot as well. I can imagine they'll fit into a lot of lineups. A home dog slightly now, which is rare. Like we talked about, the 1 seed's never been a dog in the divisional round, but they're still at home. And it's not a high implied team total for Atlanta either. And I think they'll be able to get pressure on Matt Ryan. So I like the Eagles at home at only 2,600 as well in DraftKings. I think they'll end up being the chalk.
Yeah. Freeman, what are your thoughts on some like contrarian defenses? Are you interested in the Jags? Obviously they have come at a little bit of a discount. They've been, I don't know how many weeks they've been the most expensive defense on the slate, and now they're the 3rd most expensive defense on a short slate. Seems pretty interesting,
Yeah, I guess they probably will be contrarian, given that some people will probably be interested in going with Steelers there. And I don't know. I mean, actually, I don't know how contrarian they will be. It's hard for me to gauge defenses and think like, oh, this is going to be a contrarian defense. I normally just kind of think about trying to match with maybe like the running back or to just stay away from the other offenses that I'm stacking and just go with kind of what fits with the salary. So I don't know. It's kind of hard for me to know what will be contrarian. I don't know. Pete, do you have thoughts on like what will be a contrarian defense here?
These road defenses will all be contrarian. I think that especially Atlanta on DraftKings, you're paying up to be contrarian there. Maybe not as contrarian on FanDuel because if you need the total savings, that's where you're going to have to go. But on DraftKings, I think Atlanta will be super contrarian as a road expensive defense, more expensive than Minnesota, New England. They're the second most expensive defense on the board. Jacksonville will probably be not as low owned. They'll probably be the most heavily owned defense that's on the road. But, I think New Orleans is interesting. Atlanta, you're paying up to be contrarian in a big way. It's kind of one of those things where these home defenses will choke up the ownership like they normally do. And you just have to figure out if you think there's enough equity with these road defenses for the ownership.
Okay. I mean, you can make the case for any of these defenses other than the Titans, like into GPP, I will say the Jacksonville defense,
Titans will be the most contrarian maybe over Atlanta, but
they will. I think that's true. The Jags scored 28 DraftKings points in Pittsburgh earlier this year. They had 5 interceptions. Freeman, we were talking about it, like coaches are dumb. Like, who knows? Maybe Ben gets out there and throws it 60 times again and tries to deal with Jalen Ramsey and he picks him off. But, it's hard to tell.
Yeah, and the weather is not going to be fantastic either. I think 23-degree weather. So, yeah, who knows? Tomlin could call like 60 pass plays. It's the perfect environment for it.
Yep. All right. Before we get out of here, let's make a couple bold calls. I won't ask you for 2 bold calls, just because it's a shorter slate. So just anything you feel bold about this week, whether it's a DFS call, whether it is a call about one of these Vegas lines or the betting market in general, a prop or whatever. Freeman, what are you feeling bold about on the slate?
It's hard for this to really qualify as a bold call, so I'll have to make it bigger. So I think Eagles win. But right now I think they're underdogs by only about 2.5, 3 points. So I'll say that they win by a touchdown or by double digits or whatever. But I think they pull out the win. For players, this might sound – I don't know if this is bold. Bortles doesn't throw an interception. I don't know if that's bold, but maybe he actually has a better game than people think. But he won't throw an interception.
I feel like that is really bold.
Yeah.
Pete, is that bold enough?
That's fine. Sure. Whatever. It's a Bortles playing well. That's bold. I'm going to go along those lines. I'm going to say Jaguars win outright again, which would be very bold given their 7.5-point dogs. Hopefully our boss, Chad Millman, is right. The Jaguars and the Saints get the Super Bowl. That would be neat. In terms of a player to be bold on, I'm going to go with Nick Foles. I've kind of talked about him. I'll say he is the highest scoring quarterback. I definitely think Brady is a huge favorite, but for being bold, I'll say Nick Foles. In all reality, I do like him on DraftKings with the savings.
Theoretical question. If the Jags and the Patriots win this week, how big are – like what is the spread there? By how much are the Patriots favored next week? I mean,
probably around the same. I mean, it depends on how each team wins too. But yeah, probably 7 points, 7.5 points.
Yeah,
I really don't think they'll be like crazy big favorites over. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they're 10-point favorites. I mean, if they blow out the Titans and the Jaguars, like squeak out like a 7-6 game or something like that.
I would be surprised if they were double-digit favorites.
Yeah, I would too. I would think it's around the same, honestly. Yeah. Especially if the Jaguars win. I mean, going into Pittsburgh and winning, like, yeah, and if they win in a really nice fashion too, I mean, it could be tighter spread than that. But I would expect around the touchdown.
That would be interesting. Yeah. So, like, Freeman, do you think the Jags or the Steelers are a tougher matchup for what the Patriots want to do?
I don't know, probably about the same. I think the Steelers. Actually, no, I don't think it is about the same. I think it's the Steelers. I think the Jags look very much like the type of team that gets crushed in a conference championship game, like overperforming up to that point, and an offense that isn't good, and a defense that is good, but I think could be exploited by a veteran coach and veteran quarterback, and then a lot of pressure being put on an offense that just caves and then turns the ball over a lot and puts its defense in bad field position, and then it just like spirals out of control. So I would go with the Steelers as the tougher matchup. I mean, we've seen them take the Patriots to the final seconds of a game this season. Like we've seen them basically go toe-to-toe with the Patriots. I don't think the Jags can do that.
Yeah. Interesting. Last question, Pete. Are you buying in at all to like this narrative about like this story that came out about the Patriots and them being extra motivated or anything like that? Like they want to destroy every team and put up points? Like is that factoring it all into anything that you're doing, or is it just the playoffs? They're going to play hard anyway.
Yeah, you have the Instagram from Tom Brady. You have Belichick saying Belichick things. They're feuding. Jimmy Goat, he realizes he traded away the best quarterback of all time. So, yeah, there's a lot of things going on in the Patriots locker room. There's the ESPN story, and I don't know. It can't be good, but knowing the Patriots, I feel like they're going to come out and execute. All those guys have so much pride. They've been in a ton of situations before. So, yeah, I think the Patriots roll here versus the Titans.
It's going to be fantastic when the Patriots win their third Super Bowl in 4 years to kind of provide like 3 and 4 bookends for Brady's career, and then he retires and Belichick hates himself.
It's interesting. I would love. I'm sure there's not odds on like Brady retiring this year after a Super Bowl. I would imagine it would be very low, right?
Yeah, if Brady retires, that will destroy the Patriots. Like they would have had the future right there and then traded it away and then lost their future again. That would be amazing.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Even though I wouldn't put it past Belichick to somehow like figure some way to like trade back for Jimmy G or something. I don't know. Oh
that
gosh.
would never happen.
Oh gosh. All right, we're falling apart here. We're gonna end it there. Thank you guys for listening or watching as always. Good luck this week. Hope to see FantasyLabs guys at the top of the leaderboards, and we will talk to you guys soon.